Welcome to my presentation on Jean Lee. This is the media analysis for Assignment 1. Today's case to be explored is the one surrounding Marjorie Jean Maud, or more well known as Jean Lee. She is noted in history as the last woman to be hanged in Australia when she descended down into the gallows of Pentridge Prison in the suburb of Coburg in Melbourne, Victoria, on the morning of the 19th of February 1951. Jean Lee was a prostitute and she worked with her lover Robert David Clayton and his friend Norman Andrews. The trio would work together to extort men for money. Jean Lee and her two male counterparts received capital punishment for the murder of a 73-year-old bookkeeper and landlord, William Kent. How are the offenders depicted? The offenders are two males and Jean Lee. Even though all three helped in the killing of the same man, all media attention was mainly on Jean. Majority of news articles depicted her as being responsible for the crime she committed and she must be held accountable to them. The label of murder and murderess were put onto Jean. There's even an article quoting an eye for an eye. Her name is even usually put into the titles of the articles and even in the articles before the men are even mentioned. There is a selection of articles that do discuss that Jean should be spared and given a life sentence instead because she is a woman. In these circumstances, the media is highlighting the fact that she is a woman more than putting the emphasis on her murderer label. Much less attention is placed on the two men who were also involved in the crime. The fact that Jean was a woman took most of the spotlight. The articles that do mention the men speak of them in terms of facts. They are simply just mentioning that the men were involved in the murder. That's it. There is no emotive language tied onto them as compared to Jean. The men are simply mentioned as being there. While the crime itself is labeled as horrific, this label is not pushed onto the men as much. They were usually described as Jean's accomplices. How is the victim depicted? The victim, William Kent, also does not receive as much media attention as Jean. He is mainly mentioned as the victim, but the articles don't necessarily paint him as helpless, innocent, or as a tragedy. One article does mention him as a victim of horrific torture and a cold-blooded murder. Again, just like the two men, William Kent is not put into the spotlight at all. When he is mentioned, it's more towards the description of the murder, that he was battered to death and his money was stolen. The most that is mentioned about him in most articles was his age of 73 and that he was a bookkeeper. Kent is merely presented again in a factual way most of the time. He was simply a victim of this crime, no emphasis on much else, but some articles do pay recognition that the act of the murder against him was terrible, and they push that forward using graphic language to describe his ordeal. Language in articles and today's reporting. The language used in the articles is not fairly strange, as the incident was not a very long time ago. However, the patterns of thinking and the social normalities of the time do come through the writing. When describing the murder incident, some articles do go into some graphic details, which is different to murders reported today, as we spare the viewers of such graphic details. Another matter that comes through is the mention that Jean should be spared only on the fact that she is a woman. A number of articles talk about her past. Perhaps the mention of this is to get the audience of the time familiar with her and not judge her based on one act, as they will be able to see her rough past. Whereas the men, on the other hand, even though they partook in the same crime, they do not get discussed as much as Jean. This highlights that just because Jean was a woman and she was headed for the death penalty, she drew most of the public's and media's fascination. If this crime was reported today, there would be no death penalty, so it is hard to compare, but there would be most likely a more balanced attention between all of the offenders. Movements to reprieve Jean Lee. While many articles do support Jean Lee's capital punishment, such as one article that took statements from the public about their opinion, saying that if she took part of the crime, she needs to be punished, and that the movement of equality between men and women is applied here too. One statement saying, a woman is just as capable of murdering as a man. Another article also brings statistics stating that 67% of Australians favour the death penalty for brutal murder. On the other side of the coin, there are many articles that spoke against the hanging of Jean Lee. Majority of the articles that want to reprieve Jean Lee is because of the fact that she is a woman. In these instances, the media have stated that it is the Labour Party who is pushing this movement. This represents the reality of the time, that just because she is a woman, circumstances should be different for her. In one article, where they have gotten a statement from a taxi driver, he stated that Jean should not get the death penalty, but the other men should, because they probably led her into it. The reality that the media creates by always putting Jean first and talking about her past and representing her in a drastically different way to the men has possibly had an effect on the public, and that's why there's such a reprieve Jean movement. But also the period of the time does speak for the fact that there were gender inequalities, and that the media perhaps was reporting as it would when concerned with a woman. They labeled her as a tragic story. In conclusion, Jean Lee was marked as the last woman to be hanged in Australia, and prior to that there was also a bit of a time gap between her and the last woman hung before her. So the fascination from the media is understandable but not justified. Moral lessons that could be taken from this case, I believe, have already been done. As in today's media, punishment would not depend on gender. This event was portrayed more as a fascination of a woman with a death sentence more than someone's life who was taken away unfairly, which is more likely how it would be reported today. The media at the time heavily drew on the fascination that she was a woman involved in a very serious criminal charge. Adding onto the death penalty would definitely draw readers into wanting to know more about her. Hence the many articles that would go into depth about her and her life. The men in this case, including the victim, never received anywhere near as much attention as Jean. Perhaps this speaks for the social norms and media of the time, that men were always known for engaging in crime, but then when a woman comes into the spotlight, it's something that would fascinate everyone. This is a list of my bibliography, which is also included in my transcript. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope you have a good day.